Hello everyone, welcome to Middle Fantasy. I'm Zach. And before we start this video, I wanted to add a little disclaimer to this. Today we're going to be talking about how Brandon Sanderson writes disabilities. I'm actually joined by my good friend Liz from the Duke and Duchess podcast. Check out her show down below in the links. But today we're going to be talking a lot about mental illness, struggles with like drug addiction and many of those things. And before I started, I just wanted to say that, these are very serious things, and if you're experiencing depression or thoughts of, overwhelming odds, especially during these times, there are many great resources, and I'm going to probably have a link down below to a few of them that you can use if you're having a hard time. We do kind of make some lighthearted jokes in this episode, and it's one of those things like when we're talking about this is a very important subject. I just wanted to make like a disclaimer about this for people that really don't want to listen to this, but if you do, please enjoy the video. We had like such a great conversation, and I hope you all will enjoy it. Well, see you there. Hello everyone, welcome to Middle Fantasy, the show where I talk about science fiction and fantasy. I am your host Zach, and today I have a very special episode. Today we're going to be talking more about my man crush Brandon Sanderson. And to help me with that, I actually have a very lovely guest who I'm so happy to have. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Liz from the Duke and Duchess podcast. We have talked quite a bit about Brandon Sanderson, and I'm really excited to dive into this topic.
Yeah, we've talked about Brandon Sanderson, we've talked about Rick Riordan, we've talked about a lot of authors and our crushes when it comes to these people. Now, you do the Duke and Duchess podcast, which is a weekly read-along podcast, which you have delved through Brandon Sanderson's work, Patrick Rothfuss's, Scott Lynch, and it's always fun and has some amazing things. What has been some of your favorite things to do doing that podcast?
Well, anyone who listens know that I am an armchair psychology geek, so I love to, get into the DSM-5 and sort of like, diagnose fictional people with different things. But I really, for me, the fantasy genre, what I love the most about it is how you can discuss serious things like mental illness, things that touch all of our lives in this different framework, and kind of give a different perspective on those topics. So that's something that's very, very near to my heart.
Now I have to ask you, Liz, what is your relationship with fantasy and how did you get started?
Oh, well, I definitely, my relationship with fantasy started as a way of escaping my own issues in childhood. And I think a lot of us, that was my first love and my first escape from life. So the first series, I kind of started with Arthurian fiction and Mary Stewart's The Crystal Cave.
Okay.
And from there went on to Marion Zimmer Bradley and all of those kinds of things. Of course, Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, and my first, I think what cemented my identity as a true science fiction fantasy geek was The Wheel of Time. I discovered that in my early 20s and would camp out in front of the Barnes and Noble the night before it. The only person there, me and my brother, waiting for the next Wheel of Time book and just looking like a crazy person. So getting into that series really kind of cemented my identity as a genre nerd.
Yeah, no, I have actually a very similar experience with that, like camping out. But what I would do is I would come maybe 2 or days earlier to a bookstore and ask, hey, do you have this book? Just like nonchalantly.
Do you have it yet?
Yeah, do you have it yet? And sometimes they would have it. And they're like, sometimes they would give it to me. Sometimes, like, there's this one time I was looking for a book and it was out like a week before it was supposed to be out, just on the shelf. And I'm like, oh my God. And just run home, lock the doors, and never come out until it's done. But speaking of fun things, today we're going to be talking about a subject that is actually, I would consider it a very interesting and very important topic. Today we're going to be talking about how Brandon Sanderson talks about mental illness and how he kind of talks about disability in a lot of his books. We might be throwing some spoilers for Stormlight Archive, so if you don't want that, leave now. We'll have maybe like a little tag down below when we're not spoiling stuff, but just be careful with that. We might be talking more about some other things within the Cosmere, but they won't be spoiler stuff. We might just be talking about some characters. But why don't we get started? Now, Liz, when it comes to Brandon Sanderson and him writing disability, what has been like your relationship with that? plus when it comes to other authors when they handle things like disability or mental illness?
Yeah. So when an author wants to touch on that topic, especially, for me, particular like addiction, depression, those kinds of things are things that I have personal experience with. So when an author kind of wants to dive into that, they need to be really careful. I get very exasperated when there are, stereotypes or caricatures thrown around, or when it's used as an easy plot device. But I haven't found that in any of Brandon Sanderson's works. I've really, it's one of the things that really impresses me about him.
Yeah, no, most definitely, especially when it comes to reading. Like, I used to read, like, a lot of, like, YA books where they would fall into those categories of, like, stereotyping disability, identity, sexuality, to the point of where I just felt like, well, we just needed a book with this check mark in it, and we'll just get those check marks. Like, there are so many cases. Like, there's this one book called, I want to say Asylum. I can't remember the name of the author, but literally the whole book takes place in, like, a creepy asylum. It's like a knockoff of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, and it just runs the gambit of, like, oh, man, this is real bad. Has there ever been, like, a book that just you started reading and you're just like, wow, this is really bad?
Oh man, there are so many times. I'm trying to think of the specific titles, but I definitely remember a series where there was a character who was an addict, and she literally kind of put her baby in like a drawer to sleep, and she was like, "Oh baby, why aren't you happy there in your little drawer?" And I was like, that is not what addicts, I mean, maybe they would do that, but that's not what they think or how they feel. It's really frustrating when an author doesn't do the research or like talk to people who have actually had that problem, and but still are going to put that in a book.
Now, for me, when it comes to like Brandon Sanderson, especially with Stormlight Archive, the approaches that he takes is just so interesting because he's just honest, but I remember like the reason why I fell in love with him was like that post he did recently about like, hey, like I'm writing a character, Risen, who's kind of disabled, but I don't know how to like handle this properly. Is there anyone that I know that would want to read this and make adjustments if necessary? And I felt like, wow, that's like a really big important thing, especially like I don't have all the answers, but someone has this experience, please correct me. We want this to be right.
Yeah, that's very impressive.
When it comes to the characters in Stormlight, what has been some of your favorites when it comes to like handling, I wouldn't even call them arcs, rather than like they're just coming to terms with who they are and figuring out where they are in the place in the world?
Well, I was really moved by Teft's story, especially when you get into Oathbringer and when you get into, when he's kind of in this active relapse addiction mode. That's something that I have personal experience with. And, for me especially, I was reading the scene where Teft's Spren is kind of like just dogging him. And I was thinking about how that was such a poignant and a true moment. When you're in addiction, your hope kind of follows you. And sometimes it feels like all of the people who care about you are kind of like this specter that's just following you. And you resent that, because you resent anything that's keeping you from this thing that makes you feel okay. But in the end, that's the thing that saves you. And so just the image of the Spren kind of following Teft as he's going through his bottom and just being like, come on, you can do better, you can be better. And him just being like, leave me alone. I really felt that.
Yeah, I was about to say, yeah, totally. When it comes to that, especially like the part that always gets me is the sudden realization when he sells his jacket and then he realizes, oh my God, like what he did, he didn't even realize what he was doing until all the puzzle pieces came into place because of just fire moss.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very well written. I was really impressed with that character arc.
Yeah, no, that's a really good one, especially when it comes to him speaking his oaths, and he's pretty much like, oh my God, it's like, I'll protect everyone, even if I hate myself or something. I'm like butchering it right now because I don't have those notes up there, but it was so powerful of a scene because I always think about that. Like for me, when it comes to like one of my favorite characters is like Renarin, because like that is like dangerous territory, especially when you're talking with someone that has autism, where they're either like, the way that I've always seen it, and also how Brandon Sanderson's kind of talked about, is like the Hollywood autism. Like you get like the Rain Man, you get someone that's super like genius, or they, have like their little fix-its. But when it comes to Renarin, it's more of the truest version of it because it's more of like because I have Asperger's, so I guess it's not even called that anymore. Welcome to the world of psychology, where I technically got cured, but they just put me into a different label. I told that to my psych teacher once, like, oh, they don't have Asperger's anymore. And I'm like, oh, thank God I'm cured. And he looked at me like, no, that's not how it works. But again, it's like when he's trying to have like his social interactions are just so interesting. But the most heartbreaking moment is in like the Dalinar flashback chapters when he hands him the booze. And I'm like, oh, God, this is... Oh.
You know, what I love the most about Renarin is the fact that, you know, he is portrayed as being kind of always a little different from everyone else, and people look at him and they're like, oh, there's something different about him. There's some people are like, there's something off about him. But, you know, at the end we find out that because of his differences and because he's not a typical Radiant, he has something to offer the world that nobody else can, you know. And the fact that this is a spoiler here, but the fact that his differences and the fact that he bonded this corrupted Spren as well is what makes him is what helps to make him sort of a blind spot to Odium that he might end up, I mean, in my prediction, that's just, I think he's going to be one of the keys to defeating him. So the fact that he has something to offer because of his differences, not in spite of, is how I really love the treatment of that character.
Well, especially the thing that I love that Brandon Sanderson does, especially with the magic system, is you have this magic system where, you know, you can lose an arm and it grows back, but when it comes to things like mental illness or something that's just a core part of you, that isn't fixed. Like Renarin doesn't suddenly get, my autism's fixed, or Kaladin's suppression is fixed. And I'm like, that is such an important thing because it isn't a part of someone that isn't broken. It's just a part of them, which I find to be, any other author probably would have been like, Kaladin, you're now happy now. And I'm like, I feel nothing. That's the point.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a part in Ryson's story where she's talking about how you know, so she's paralyzed in this accident, and when her mentor catches up with her, she lets him know that she had tried to go to one of the Radiants sometime later and get healed, but that it had been too long, and that because her paralysis had become part of her self-identity, it couldn't be healed anymore. And I thought that was such a profound thing, that, like, you know, that claiming your disability as part of your identity, and then watching Ryson kind of have to struggle with that and overcome it and just end up, you know, deciding to go ahead and live her life the way she was planning to originally and not letting that stop her, I thought was really powerful.
Yeah, especially like the whole scene, because it's like that, almost like that bank heist in the end of that book where she's like, I don't need any help.
I love it.
And she's like crawling and like she's like kicking butt. That's why I'm so excited for the new novella that's coming out, Dawn Shard. It's all about her, and it's going to have her and Lopin, and it's going to be like, oh no, this is going to either be the greatest thing ever or I'm going to just jump off the ship. Yeah. See, that's why I'm excited to see stuff like that, because it's interesting. The way that I think about this is the same way I think about like Avatar: The Last Airbender, or like, more importantly, I guess Korra. When you have like the season 3, there's like characters that have like missing arms and they use water bending as like their arms. They use like, it doesn't define them, whereas like you can be a person and have all these problems, but in the end of the day, it's just who you are, and magic doesn't solve all your problems. That's why I love that about Brandon Sanderson, is magic doesn't solve all your problems, especially when it comes to like characters like Shallan, where she has to coexist with both magic and who she is as a person.
Well, yeah, and the fact that magic sort of, I would argue, almost kind of contributes to Shallan's problems, as far as it gives her kind of a coping mechanism that doesn't end up being healthy with her, and the ability to create these different personas. And I love the way that A, that magic is tied to personal development in this series, and B, how it kind of can interact with the characters' health problems.
And that's the cool thing about, like, when it comes to like just Stormlight in general, is like the magic system's so good because it isn't like, oh, you can improve just by like working at the yieldy gym, but it's more like coming up with your own personal truths. I mean, I'm doing a whole episode right now about Lightweavers, and I'm like, it's so interesting that they don't have to speak oaths, but they have to speak inner truths, which can be 1,000 times more worse, because as humans, we're not perfect creatures, but sometimes we have biases on like what we can and can't do. And like, you have to actually say that. That's impossible sometimes. Like, oh no.
Yes, I've always loved Brandon Sanderson's magic systems, but this one is the tops for me.
Now, when it comes to you, Liz, because you're a mother, is that when it comes to books, do you try to like look for? I'm guessing you let your kids read whatever they want, but at the same time, do you try to like look at the books and do they ever come to you with like questions about like? I know we've talked about Percy Jackson. Percy Jackson has a lot of things to do with like ADHD and disability. Do they ever like come to you and talk to you about that stuff, or is it something that like is just a topic that you should leave to the author to help define that, or is it something that you need to have a conversation depending on the book that you're reading?
Oh, no way. We have definitely used genre literature as a tool for talking to our kids about that stuff. And I have kids with, some of those issues. So Percy Jackson, for sure, we've had conversations about that. And actually, my 13-year-old son is reading Stormlight, which I have never been so happy about anything in my entire life. But I actually told him that I was coming down, and I told him that what the topic of our video was going to be. And he was like, there's people with disability in Stormlight. And I was like, puh, da, 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 da. And he was like, oh yeah, I never thought about that. So it could have been, we'll probably talk about it tonight at bedtime too, but these are great vehicles for talking about these issues with kids. And one thing I like about Brandon Sanderson's work is that I'm comfortable with my 13-year-old reading any of it. I know that, I don't even know if you call it YA fantasy, but I know that there's not going to be topics or stuff in there that I wouldn't want my entire family to read. So
it's not a wise man's fear.
It is not. No. There's no Felurian. I mean, I love that book too, but you could read that when you're out of the house.
And you're married.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, even like when it comes to like just the fantasy genre in general, actually King Killer is a really good example of this because you have like characters like Elodin and you have like things like the Crockery, where it's like actually better example. This would probably be Ari. Ari's probably like, in my opinion, is one of the most fascinating characters that has like I would call it a disability. Like she just lives in her own world under the university, but that's what makes it so charming. And we get a whole book from her perspective, which I think the right thing that authors can do is they can have these POVs that are so much, better insight into characters to the point of where you can actually get into their shoes. I could just insert the yieldy To Kill a Mockingbird line and be done with it, but it's a really true fact. Like you don't know someone until you've stepped in their shoes.
Yeah, and Slow Regard of Silent Things is a beautifully written look at mental illness and kind of a window into what it's like to struggle with some of these different things. And if you've ever experienced that, it can be hard. It was hard for me to read, honestly. Some of the chapters were very gut-wrenching, but I know that book is very, people either like it or they hate it, but I really loved it.
Yeah, and it's interesting, especially like the history of like Ari. It's actually based off a real person that's very similar to Ari, Tunnel Bob from Wisconsin, I think Madison, where P-Roth is from. So it's really interesting to have like sometimes people can live interesting lives. At the same time, you can have people that have disabilities or have all these issues and have, like, for me, I live like a really jovial life and I don't let it get me down. But at the end of the day, it's like you can make a story about this, but it just needs to be respectful in many ways. I think that's the point.
I think I said it before, but not using mental health or disability as like a plot device, or I need my character to be here, so let me just give them this disability or this mental health issue to get them where I want them to be, or to like kind of create an emotional reaction in my readers that isn't earned. And that really bothers me when I see authors do that.
Now, when it comes to like Stormlight, what have been some moments, especially when it comes to like, just are there any particular scenes that you just stand out to you other than like the Tef scene when it comes to like Kaladin, Shallan, Yasna, or any of the other POV characters that we have that are just like, if you wanted to like show someone like a class or anyone, like this is a scene to help handle maybe some type of disability or mental illness, this would be the scene you would show them?
Well, there are a bunch, but off the top of my head, I would say the scene where Yasna chooses not to kill Renarin And Renarin is sitting there, and he's been, he's had all these visions of the future and all these terrible things happening. And he knows that Yasna is going to come and kill him. And he thinks that's probably the right thing to do because he's bonded this corrupted Spren. And in his mind, everything about himself is wrong because he doesn't understand himself. And then when Yasna, makes that choice instead to extend compassion and understanding, and even though part of her kind of logical brain is saying, yeah, you need to kill him, he's been corrupted, this is the right thing to do, instead she chooses to extend understanding and compassion. And that is just like, that gives me goosebumps every time I read it, because then they're able to change kind of the set future that he sees, and they're able to work together. And like I said, I feel like it's going to come out that Renarin is going to be able to offer something that nobody else can, and he's going to be able to change the world in a way that nobody else can because of his differences. So, and for me, that just says something about how are we supposed to treat people who we don't understand or who may seem different from us,
Yeah, the one that I love the most, especially, I think we're just bringing up Oathbringer a little bit because it's such a good book that really explores this, is the interlude chapter with Taravangian, where like you actually get to see into his mind, and he's like smart Taravangian, but then he's like I don't want to go away, and it's like he doesn't know who will be the next day, which is like being in like a first person view of that is so horrifying, because it's like you actually have that type of sympathy for a person that has a murder room and stuff.
Murder room, a murder hospital.
But yeah, it's like that type of like emotional impact. The other one that I think of as well when it comes to like just depression is the part in The Way of Kings where Kaladin's just about to jump off the cliff, and like this is the only alternative until Syl's pretty much like his second wind. No pun intended.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of like those elements, like if you want to show like what depression's like, Kaladin's actually like a really good example of it, though it isn't like to the point of where it's like, we get it, you're depressed, but he has his ups and his downs, which I find that to be so important for a person that has depression. That is like a very important thing, because he isn't just always down or he isn't always high. He has his peaks and valleys. Though I think one of the biggest ones that I absolutely love is actually Dalinar, because not only does he have PTSD, but he also had a drinking problem, to the point of where you see it through his flashback chapters. You see how he gets progressively worse, which I found that to be such an interesting plot element, because it isn't like... I found this interesting that I read an article kind of about this, and how Dalinar is an interesting character because not only his motivation, not because his wife got fridged, but because he's like trying to do better for himself, which that line, you can't take my pain, is so great.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I also really like the scene in Oathbringer where Kaladin decides that he's not ready to swear the fourth ideal.
Yeah, that's a great scene.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that he's forgiven by Syl, and he's not like, it's like sometimes it's okay if you're not ready to like push forward in an area of your recovery. Like it's okay to just be where you're at. And the fact that she kind of still just accepts him and loves him and urges him to like go easy on himself, I absolutely loved that part.
Yeah, especially like the scene leading up to that, the Moash stuff. It's like where you actually getting into like Kaladin's brain, and he's having like almost like this crisis of faith, where he's like seeing all these people he's helped be like massacred, and he's like he freezes, and I'm like, people are like, oh no, why would you freeze? And like, that's the proper response. Your brain's just telling you stop.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very controversial scene. A lot of people really didn't like that. I think for me, I totally get why he reacted that way.
No, the way that I think about it is like the equivalent of like coding with like ones and zeros. Kaladin saw it too, and it's like, what is this?
Yes, that's perfect. That's a perfect description.
Yeah, there's that. Though, I gotta say, my favorite character when it comes to just their free spiritness is Lift. Just because when you get into her whole book, like, it's not about just growing up. It's about, like, not wanting to be having that change of being like a woman, but at the same time, being who you want to be without people worrying about you and being awesome.
Yes.
Because I think the other thing that I love about Stormlight Archive, especially when it comes to this, is how, like, anyone can be, like, a Knights Radiant, but most of them are just fundamentally broken. Like, you have, like, in Edge Dancer, you have the really awful orphanage person get superpowers. Like, that's not fair. Why don't you give it to one of these orphans? It's like, doesn't work like that.
Yep. And the contrast, one thing I'm looking forward to the most in Rhythm of War is seeing more of the Lift and Seth relationship and how there's such an amazing balance to each other. And they're broken in very different ways. And just having this like uber serious sort of warrior who, can't get over himself, contrasted with Lift, who can't take anything seriously. And then you throw Nightblood in the mix, and I'm there for it. I'm so there for it.
Well, that's the one thing I love about, speaking of, like, Nightblood, is I love how, like, Brandon Sanderson actually deals with, like, morality as well. Because you have, like, when it comes to Nightblood, it's like, destroy evil. Like, well, I think that's very much like Eye of the Beholder. What is evil in your eyes? To the point of where it's like, murder's fun. Oh no. I've murdered these small children. Why? Oh, they're just evil. Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah, and you can see that with Taravangian too, and how he asked the Night Watcher for the capability to save the world, and you don't know, and then he's given this intelligence and this empathy, and you don't know which side is going to be is actually the capability side.
The one that I always think about that people I don't think actually bring up a lot is actually when it comes to, like, Venli and Eshonai, and how like Venli's just trying to, like, progress their people, but she doesn't know, is this the right thing or the wrong thing. I think that's also really interesting, especially when it comes to, when you discuss these things, because sometimes, wanting to do good or having, like, this weird sense of normality might not be the right sense of normal at times. Which I found that to be so interesting, especially when it comes to Venli, 'cause she's like a scientist, but at the same time, she's the cause, but also the symptom a little bit.
Yeah, and her relationship with Timber, I think, I never thought like a relationship with a thing that doesn't actually have any dialogue. Like, there's no dialogue in their relationship because Timber doesn't, like, really talk, but it's still so poignant. And the way that I think the power of hope is such an important theme especially in Stormlight, and this little ball of hope that's just following her and just saying, like, you're not too far gone. You're not too far gone. And I think that's one of the other themes that I really like about these books is that nobody's too far gone.
Yeah, especially, like, one of my favorite themes as well is that sometimes the people with the most power can be the most absolutely broken. If we look at the heralds, you really get into them. Like, wow, they're these powerful people. Like, oh no, they're so sad and they've been tortured all their lives, and there's a reason why they're going, like, low-key crazy and losing their sense of reality, because it's like, well, we've had enough and we keep doing the cycle and it's bullshit and we're done. Man, it's so much fun, like, when you get the chance to, like, actually, like, deconstruct these types of characters, especially when it comes to fantasy, because I think what fantasy does really well is you can explore these types of conversations and topics in a way where you can have it almost be a physical manifestation. If we look at things like The Thrill, and it's how it's, like, bloodlust and, like, oh my god. And that stuff is always crazy. It's how, like, Brandon Sanderson's always, like, one step ahead, because he'd always, like, I guess he would do the Robert Jordan thing and, like, capitalize something that's important. I thought that it was so interesting.
I just want to see Brandon Sanderson's yarn wall one day. He's got to have a mansion with, like, just a huge... If he doesn't have a giant room in his house covered with the strings and, like, going to different things, I'm going to be very disappointed.
No, he has, like, his mind palace, like in Sherlock a little bit. It's just like...
Oh, there you go. It's
like a dilapidated medieval castle. The whole castle is just, like, you turn the other side of it, just a gigantic yarn wall.
That's it. That's my canon. That's my head canon. That's true.
It's either that or he has a 1 terabyte hard drive just filled with just one Word document that just says all my awesome ideas. Oh. And that's the funny thing about it, because you can, like, have those tongue-in-cheek moments, especially when it comes to Brandon Sanderson, who writes all this stuff and how he has to keep, like, the sense of continuity. But when it comes to his magic system, he tries to keep it as grounded as possible in an interesting way that isn't just, oh, I'm God, so I can fix everything. No, there's always consequences and repercussions for everything. And you can even see that within, like, the magic system. Like, soul casting, if you're not, like, a Radiant, is horrifying.
Yeah.
And I love that you have like those safeguards in place. Though at the same time, the one thing that I love that Brandon Sanderson does really well is like my favorite thing ever in the whole series is the relationship between Adolin and Renarin, because they just accept each other, and I found that to be like, you could have the tropey thing of like, oh, I don't understand my brother, he's weird, and he's like, nope, this is my brother, and this is who he is, and I love him.
Yeah, that's really touching.
Because that's the beautiful thing about the series is you have all these people that lean on each other. Like Bridge 4 leans on everyone. Like there's never once they question if Kaladin's fit to be the leader.
Yeah, and watching Bridge 4 accept Renarin, I think that's a really touching thing as well. Like watching him find his place in this group of people. You know, one thing that strikes me about Renarin too is there's a neat exploration of how the Alethi culture interacts with his issues to alienate him. So like he's not only is he born with epilepsy and some, kind of like atypical development, but he's also in this culture where everything is divided by gender, and anything that he might possibly be interested in is considered not masculine and therefore like not okay. And there's all these taboos, and just how harmful that is, and especially for people who aren't, don't fit the status quo, how kind of harmful that is.
Yeah, no, most definitely, especially when it comes to like Renarin is like, you have like, he wants to be more like academic, but academia for men is like shunned upon. But yeah, we have that flip at the end of Oathbringer where Dalinar, who's pretty much the manliest man who ever walked the manliest earth, decides, I want to write my own story. And suddenly you break that norm. So I'm interested to see how that, when someone finds his fanfic, I guess it would be like How I Did It, the Dalinar Kholin story. Oh man, but yeah, it's also interesting, especially when it comes to like, even like within the Alethi world, like you have like those like discrepancies, especially like men can't read, but they can read symbols, where it's like, you could fundamentally destroy people's entire lives just by saying, well, you can't read, so I'll just write that I hate you and you're a poopy head. Yeah. Which you can do, but that's the interesting exploration of like the culture. Though when it comes to the culture, what do you think about like how in Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight, how they do handle disability in this way, where I guess we kind of talked about it a little bit, but like just like the full scope of the world.
Well, and I mean, I think in a lot of ways, the Alethi culture is a kind of a reflection of our culture. When you look at especially like how like super separated the gender roles have become, and I remember looking at ads from toys from the 80s when I was a kid, and how there wasn't this everything over here is pink, everything over here is blue, and there has to be a girl's version of everything and a boy's version of everything. And there was some of that, but there was a lot more things that were just for everybody to play with. And how I'm getting kind of sidetracked here, but
no, you're fine. We can talk about toys all day because I like 80s toys.
Yes, but like back in the 80s, Legos were just Legos. There wasn't, now there's girls Legos and boys Legos, and if you want a bow and arrow set, there's girls ones and there's boys ones. And just in 30 years, how quickly that's changed. And I think that seeing this play out, that kind of dynamic play out in a fantasy setting, and you can just look at it in a different framework and be like, oh, that's weird, something that we accept in our own culture. But if we look at it that way, it seems kind of weird and kind of makes us think about, wow, is that really helpful or is it not helpful?
Oh, you mean the whole like left hand thing for women?
Yes. Just let's pick a random body part that we decide is not modest. And
my favorite thing now is like going on like the Reddit, and it's like not safe for Voron. So it's like people showing their left hands.
Yes, that's really funny. It's really funny.
Like, okay, Brandon Sanderson, you should make like a weird pinup calendar of just like
just left hands.
Yeah. That would just be silly. But yeah, the same as how when I think about it as well, I think of like the spicy food versus sweet food thing.
Yes.
I'm like,
yeah.
Oh man, my stomach would hate me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like when I think about that stuff, especially within like the cultures, it's interesting when you have like also all the other cultures, like when you get to like Shinovar, or you get to like even the Unalaki. I always have a hard time pronouncing it. They're just Pacific Scotlanders that are also Hawaiian.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But you have like these interesting people, like when it comes to like how they handle culture, like especially when it comes to like the Unalaki, it's like, oh yeah, like we have like a tier system of like our backup children and whoever
Our backup children, yeah.
and it's like, well, if one of them's messed up, they get out of like the line of succession, and it's like, oh my god. Then you get to the Aelish, which is the people that have all their paperwork.
The Azish, yeah.
Oh, the Aelish is probably something from a different series, but yeah, the Azish.
Those are my people, by the way. I can see myself fitting in very well with that society.
Yeah, for me, it's just like every time I worked in a corporate office or something, that's just their life. Like, I need to go to the restroom. Okay, so you need to document. Okay, I guess I'll just work
fill
at
out
Amazon.
the form. It makes sense to me. I'm just saying.
Thank you so much, Liz, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Where can they find you on social media, and where can they find the Duke and Duchess on all podcast devices?
So, yeah, anywhere you can get podcasts, you can just search for the Duke and Duchess podcast. You can find us on the dukeandduchesspodcast.com or on Facebook, our group page. If you search for the Duke and Duchess podcast group, you do have to answer a question to get admitted to the group. But once you're in, that's where most of our discussion happens. We're also on all of the Reddits, Twitters, all of the stuff.
Yeah, that question's really hard. They asked me what was in my pocket, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, joke's on you, during quarantine, I'm not wearing pants. Actually, I'm wearing pants right now.
Same, just for you, Zach.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for watching this amazing video. This was such a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Liz. I really, really appreciate taking the time out of your day. Talk about fantasy and just have a fun chat. Like always, everyone, may your food and drink ever be tasteful, and may your books be filled with fantasy and adventure. Bye, everybody. See ya!